This is SRM Insider.
Hi, welcome to the Full Disclosure Podcast, an SRM Insider podcast. My name is Matthew Mettenheimer, and today we'll be talking about upcoming regulations in the APAC region. With me today is Mark Farley, our head of proactive services in APAC, and Kyle Schwebler, our head of incident response in the region. Mark, Kyle, it's great to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So appreciate having you both here today. Mark, could you please provide us an overview of some of the trends going on in the APAC region? I know it's quite a large geography with quite a few different countries, so staying on top of it must be difficult. But are there any kind of general trends going on at the moment?
The main trend in terms of regulation is driving cyber resilience, particularly around critical national infrastructure in different areas. So in terms of Malaysia, it's got a new cyber law which is about to come out covering 11 different national critical infrastructure areas. So these will be everything from your telecoms to your financial services to your healthcare. And the same or similar law is coming out into Hong Kong as well. In Singapore itself, the interesting bit is to move from quite a narrow scope on critical infrastructure to widen it out to, those supporting companies as well as companies that are, overseas but do provide services to the Singapore region.
I was just going to jump in there and say, I agree 100% with what Mark said there. In fact, I think if you asked me that question, I would have said the exact same thing. This sort of increased focus on sort of protecting critical national infrastructure. That seems to be the main trend and the main driver when it comes when we're looking at regulations across the region. As you suggested, Asia and the broader Asia Pacific region, it doesn't have that sort of one consolidated piece of data regulation that that governs cybersecurity and data protection that we might see in Europe with the likes of the GDPR. But we're definitely starting to see, I think, more and more regulation come up looking at this. In addition to some of these countries that Mark was mentioning now, we're also seeing new regulations pop up in Vietnam, Bangladesh, India have a pretty stringent data breach reporting obligations in their regulations. Taiwan and Indonesia also have new regulations that have been introduced in the last 18 months. So certainly, although I think the region has been sort of lagging behind some other parts of the world for the last few years, it's certainly catching up.
No, that's really interesting, and it's really interesting to see how so many different nations are approaching this. And something that really stuck out to me that you said, Mark, was that a lot of these upcoming regulations are focusing on resiliency, and especially resiliency across multiple industries instead of just those highly regulated ones. I don't think anyone can walk away from something that happened last week, the CrowdStrike incident, which I really think brought to the forefront of many programs of how important it is to be thinking through business continuity and disaster recovery scenarios. And it's almost comical that these regulations that are coming up are focused on resiliency and business continuity events right before one of the largest IT outage in the history of the globe. So it's always interesting to see how these things kind of can mirror or be in front of some of these events, but really drive home the importance of how these regulations are moving forward. You mentioned quite a few different nations, and they're all starting to build out their own unique kind of laws and regulations. That's got to be really difficult for an industry that operates in several different countries. What are some of the challenges for our clients that are in the region that do operate, not just in Singapore, but also in Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia to India? What are some of those struggles that organizations have to stay on top of so many different regulations? And as Kyle, as you mentioned, there's not one unifying body that they can go to, such as, the EU. What's some things that are difficult there?
I guess before we talk about the challenges, I think the key thing here is actually to talk about the good news is that a lot of these these laws are all looking at the same thing. They are looking about building up resilience. So a lot of what the requirements are fairly consistent around the different rules. So it's around how a company manages risk, so the risk management framework implemented. It's how they can find and test for vulnerabilities, so the security testing. It's around how they do sort of threat intelligence and threat detection. How good are they to actually finding issues? How good are they at doing instant response? So can they find an instant recover from it? And then it's also linked to sort of the business continuity element. So should an incident happen, how good are they at actually recovering from them? A lot of these rules are also about looking to establish accountability with leadership within an organization to make sure that there is buy-in from the top of an organization to drive the changes to improve the resilience of these sort of target companies. And they're also looking at ways of professionalizing the cybersecurity services in a particular country. So picking Singapore and Malaysia, they've got cybersecurity licensing requirements. So if you're offering particular services, you need to go to the appropriate body and to register with them to provide, and they'll provide you a license to actually operate for those services. This is a way of making sure that the companies are getting the best advice possible from skilled operators as well. But like you said, Matt, the challenges are there, and it's all, I guess, in the nuance of these different rules, and how you interpret those bits of change.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. And it's interesting to hear that so many of the laws overlap. Being based in the United States, I think we also take kind of a similar approach as well from our regulations of what is the most stringent privacy regulation. So over here, the California Consumer Privacy Act a few years ago, very much mirroring GDPR, really was kind of the standard. So as there have been other regulations that have came on board, we've always advised clients to take a look at what's the most stringent of those regulations, because that will typically cover 95% of all the other regulations. And it sounds like there's kind of a similar approach in APAC that, yes, there will be some nuances from region to region, but if you're following those best practices across the board, you can really cover a lot of these regulations with similar control sets. Is that an accurate depiction?
I'd say that's very accurate. I guess the area where it often differs the most is with either breach notification requirements or data requirements, so particularly personal data. Some countries have quite strict data residency rules, so they want personal data to stay within the country, whereas other countries don't mind as long as the data is adequately protected when it's been transferred overseas. And then you've got all the different time frames for notification. So these are always vary different country. There's often things like a threshold to harm. So as in how much of the data leaked, how much data was there, and what will be the impact on the subjects. Well, that will often dictate whether you have to notify the individuals or the level of notification you have to do to a regulator. And obviously this will also determine ultimately financial penalties if there would be any, based on, I guess, the data loss.
Interesting. It definitely feels like some of those early GDPR days of understanding of where your cross-border data transfer is and where you necessarily need to think about that as an organization. Hey, does it make sense that we just keep all of the data, for instance, if it's in Malaysia that has stricter requirements, staying within Malaysia versus transferring out to a different location?
If I could just jump in there with another point, especially with what you just said there, Matt. As we saw in Europe, in the EU with the GDPR back in the day, I think in Asia what we'll see as well, another challenge, in order to become compliant with a lot of these obligations, is around finding the budget for it. And I think we saw the same in the EU back in the day. I think organizations in the APAC region, they are currently and will continue to struggle, I think, for a while to find the necessary budget to address sort of all of the priorities. That could be, addressing controls around regulatory compliance, but it could also just be around implementing new tools and technology to address like fundamental cybersecurity risk, or possibly even acquiring cyber insurance to transfer some of that risk. But I think that at this stage, cybersecurity budgets in the region haven't necessarily caught up with the evolving threat landscape, and certainly not with, I think, the regulatory environment. And it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I suspect that in coming years, as broader cyber awareness starts to spread and grow, business leaders will become, more aware of the risks, and I think they will start allocating more budget.
Yeah, I think that's a very great call out, right? Whenever we're talking cybersecurity, there is a real cost to it. Everyone would love to have the most secure program, but there really is that balancing act. And from my personal experience working with some organizations in the APAC region in the past, and it sounds, Kyle, that you have similar experience, that historically they may have not allocated as much budget as we've seen in their European counterparts or their United States counterparts. But because of these regulations, we're going to more than likely start seeing that shift where we're really going to start doubling down on, hey, security is, not just a cost center. It's something that we really need to invest in and think through. And most certainly, I love your call out for cyber insurance. I know many of the large insurance carriers have really been expanding out in the Asian Pacific region. If it's something that, an organization really needs to look into of, hey, how can we transfer some of this risk or make sure that we're covered should an event occur to get in with an insurance provider. I think that's something that I think the region will really benefit from and really help mature the program. Once you get the budgets in place and once you're able to up your tooling, get more professionals, and even Mark, call back to what you were saying earlier, some of the countries having actual certifying bodies for security individuals, we're going to see a lot of really great innovation, I think, come out of the region here in the coming months. Nothing like some good regulations to help push everyone along the way, I always say. But
I think just to add to that, what's also interesting is many of these regulations do give additional powers to regulators or governing bodies within the different countries to actually go in and often investigate should a breach happen. So maybe that could just be requiring the company that got compromised to hand over information. Could also be the regulator going in and doing an investigation themselves. So obviously with those extra, rules coming in, it's going to obviously encourage companies to actually, invest in cybersecurity to make sure if a regulator did come calling, they had, the appropriate control sets and guidelines in place to stop the attack before it happened.
Yeah. Whenever a regulator walks in post-incident, I know that everyone's hair on the back of their neck stands up a little bit. But I think that is actually an important call out. These aren't just regulations on paper. There is actually a chance that the regulators can step into the room in the office and say, hey, there was negligence here. I heard that earlier that you mentioned that we're focusing on accountability with more of the executives, that we didn't do the proper channel. So this is something that we're going to have to look at for litigation or penalties and things of that nature. I think that's really going to drive some of these discussions, right? Because a regulation is only as good as the enforcement. But if these organizations and these regulators are actually coming in post-incident, I think no one wants to be in the situation where they're talking to a regulator after a massive outage and come across as not being mature enough from their program. So I think that's a very interesting approach, and I love to see it. I guess, Kyle, thinking through some of the incident response unique capabilities in the region, I know that each country has different reporting requirements, and going back to that, data might have to be stored in specific localities. Are there any sort of incident response concerns with these upcoming regulations that really we want to focus on or companies should think through of when they are building out an incident response plan?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and I think Mark touched on this earlier, is around understanding what your data breach notification obligations are. And Mark's 100% correct. It's different in various jurisdictions. In Hong Kong, for example, there isn't a notification obligation. So if you do suffer a data breach, suffer a cyber attack, you are under no obligation to notify any regulator or the police of that breach. I think there isn't sort of an expectation that organizations will do that voluntarily, but there's no obligation. On the other hand, places like Singapore and Australia have pretty stringent notification obligations, quite in line with what you see in the EU and in some US states as well. But then on the far end of the spectrum, you've got India, for example, which actually obligates a notification of a data breach within 6 hours of it being identified, which is extremely stringent. And there's some seriously high penalties for not reporting that, up to $24 million if you fail to report that in time. If we consider some of these regions where data breach notification obligations aren't actually that stringent or don't exist at all, I think the organizations in these jurisdictions actually have a unique opportunity where in the response they can just focus on restoring business operations as quickly as possible. What we see in sort of the EU and in some other countries where there's this real strong focus on understanding the impact of data and was there data breach, and there's almost this priority in the response to try and keep the investigation focused on identifying was there data exfiltration, where actually the organization is suffering immense business interruption and the costs of that are quite high. So, in Hong Kong, for example, the priority in those first few days can really just be to restore business operations, and then you can have the opportunity to understand, what was the impact. So there's these slight nuances, and I think do present some opportunities from a response perspective. But obviously, at the end of the day, I think it all goes back to, can you prevent this from happening in the first place, or at the very least detect it and try and mitigate the impact.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And I love that call out, because I think it will drive a lot of discussion. I mean, 6 hours for notification I think that's the fastest timeline I've seen around the globe so far. We've covered quite a few regions on this podcast series, but 6 hours is definitely leading the way so far. But you're right. I think that does make a determination from a business standpoint of, hey, if we do have to get this notification out there so quickly, we do have to focus the early stages of the investigation, or at least the first 24 hours, on determining whether that data is exfiltrated, where some other parts of the APAC region, we want to get our business up and running before we worry about whether the data was exfiltrated. And I think that's going to drive a lot of strategy and a lot of nuance, as well as, as these larger organizations who operate in those different localities have to think through each of their incident response planning, whether from a, more regional standpoint or specific from country to country. That's very interesting, actually. I guess thinking through that with so much nuance, are there kind of any sort of industries that get impacted a bit heavier? I know that we mentioned that historically in APAC, it was really focused on critical infrastructure, but it sounds like it's expanding outward to other industries as well. Are there any industries kind of, under the spotlight at the moment?
I guess in terms of the regulation, it's all focused around the critical national infrastructure, whether that be either technology, energy, banking, transport, maritime, healthcare. But I guess one of the things often missing from this sort of regulation is the SME businesses, which we often see hit in the region. So these companies aren't necessarily directly impacted by this regulation, other than, I guess, there'll be more awareness of these rules, but they may be indirectly hit by them via, I guess, third-party risk management frameworks, and how, I guess, the big critical national infrastructure manage their supply chain. So they may be going out to the SME market, asking them about their security controls to help them improve their resilience, because typically the incidents that we've seen recently. A lot of them have been the small SME companies that haven't been under any of this sort of regulation. So they've actually, a lot of these companies is where operational performance has been their main driver. So they've been trying to optimize their delivery of their product while minimizing any sort of downtime.
Mark, you're speaking my language. Third-party risk, I think, is something that we've covered on every episode of this series. And it sounds, the similar problems that are happening in Europe and the United States are also happening in APAC. We are seeing a lot more incidents originate from those third-party carriers rather than the corporate itself, right? These smaller businesses that do have a play into some larger organizations might not have as robust security controls. And it sounds like that a lot of the corporations are pushing some of these regulations down onto their suppliers, which I always think is a great thing. We saw that with CMMC 2.0 in the United States on the defense contractors, that all these subcontractors are also having to get in compliance with it, even though they're not directly impacted. It sounds similar with these new regulations coming up. It's the same case. And most certainly with technology, the go fast and break thing mentality might have been a really great cry for the early 2000s, but I think based off of some of the most recent events, all these technology companies also do have to start thinking through of how do we actually make sure that we are doing our due diligence, getting in compliance with regulations, both put on ourselves, but more importantly, on some of our customers when we're not directly impacted, to prevent things such as a global IT outage, so to speak. So I think that's really interesting to see that cascading effect across multiple industries, not just your critical infrastructures, but how they'll drive a few other industries as well.
I think the one thing I would say, actually, and I think Mark would agree with me on this, especially from what we've seen on the response side of things, is that although there is potentially that cascading effect, I think that the sort of the general cyber awareness that is sort of filtering into the region, across the region, because of these new regulations, I don't think that cyber awareness has necessarily hit the SME market as well or as hard as it could have, or potentially we might hope to have seen it do. I think we're seeing a lot in the SME market, just a general lack of awareness, actually, of not just their obligations when it comes to cybersecurity, but also sort of fundamental cybersecurity risk, threats that they're faced with, and how to combat those threats as well. And I think that the region could do well with sort of a bit more sort of broader awareness push, trying to help inform and bring SME organizations along with these larger organizations that are sort of forming part of critical national infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's difficult to stay on top of all these regulations, especially with such a diverse portfolio such as APAC. And that's something we see a lot of organizations struggle with, just understanding what's going to be applicable to them versus not. Every contract has a one-off clause here and there, but staying ahead of that curve, so to speak, can really be impactful for an organization. I know, Kyle, that we've worked together in the past on threat intelligence briefings and offerings, trying to stay ahead of that, just for that particular reason, because it's not easy for these businesses to understand what's going to necessarily impact them, what might not directly impact them, but they really want to start considering as well, and what some of the best-in-class practices across the board. Hopefully we'll start seeing some more of these SME marketplaces really take that kind of threat intelligence perspective to heart and really try to get ahead of this before necessarily the day that they have to get in compliance, and then all of a sudden they have to do a lot of remediation within a 3-month period. Mark, I know from a past life, you and I worked on some very similar clients where everyone has to get in compliance with a regulation within a 3-month window, and it is a mad dash for these organizations to build out their security program to get into that compliance, and a lot can happen in that time frame. So getting ahead of it, partnering with organizations that do understand, that perspective across the region and really thinking through those regulatory concerns before, go live dates, I think can be really beneficial for a lot of these organizations, both at the corporate level and these SME businesses that we're talking through here as well. I really appreciate that call out, Kyle. I know we're getting close to time here, so I do want to open it up to the floor of Mark and Kyle. What's one thing that, if our listeners are listening to right now, they should really take to heart about these upcoming regulations in the APAC region?
I mean, the key thing is they are all changing at the moment. So 2024 is kind of a big year for the different changes that's going on. Even though you may not be aware of them, they are all coming out there. Then they are requiring, changes in how companies operate. I guess as we've seen, so with the CrowdStrike issue this week, actually, it doesn't really matter how big you are as a company. You can have these outages, you can have these problems, and it's about how you prepare for them. Not just linked to the rules and the regulations, also operationally and business focused approach. So how do you make sure you're operational at all times? Make sure you're servicing your customers best.
Great. Absolutely. Love that call. Kyle, any thoughts for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Mark. I think that's 100% correct. Regulations are important, but at the end of the day, you need to make sure you're doing what's right for your business. Just speaking from an incident response point of view, I think we'll definitely, start to see more incidents in the region. We're already seeing a bit of an uptick across the region. Interestingly, it seems to be, I don't know if it's correlation or causation, but there seems to be some sort of a matching trend with the increased regulation in certain countries and the increased number of cyber attacks we're seeing. I think, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years we start to see more and more incidents, especially sort of ransomware attacks in the Asia Pacific region, as cyber security and cyber insurance and cyber regulations become more prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. As the region gets more of a spotlight and as they just start developing their programs, I think we know all threat actors are a bit opportunistic. And if that's where we think some of some of these organizations might not have as secure as a maturity posture, most certainly they'll start targeting. So getting ahead of these regulations, getting ahead of understanding what security requirements for your business, what's the best in practice, both in practicality and on paper, and really building out that security program before any of these go live dates of these upcoming regulations can really help both from being in compliance with those regulators so that they're not knocking on your door, but also having that real world application of protecting your business should an incident occur or making you more resilient to prevent that initial incident is really impactful. I think APAC is actually one of my first clients was a Japanese bank, and it was one of my first regions I ever worked on. And so this region in particular has a lot of sentimental value to me. But it is a unique one. And I think understanding that a one-size-fits-all approach for the region might not necessarily work. And you have to really truly understand with those insights on how each nation operates and how to build a program cascading across those is really important for any of our listeners there. But Mark, Kyle, I really appreciate you joining me here today. This was a really great episode, and thank you for rounding out our regulatory series. I had a blast. I hope you do as well.
Thank you, Matt.
Great.
Yep. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for listening to Full Disclosure, an SRM Insider podcast. My name is Matt Menheimer, and I hope you have a great day.
We are SRM. Search your first call to find out more.